everyone. Welcome back to the Theory of Life podcast. We have tried this podcast about 17 times, and hopefully it works this time. So, we've had John Bryden on before. Actually, I was going to ask you the last time we did this, but I forgot, but it's a good time now.
It was...
What's up?
When the predestination election conversation.
Yes, it was. We actually did another one before that like the audio got corrupted, and so I didn't get to upload it, but it was really good. Hopefully we can do that again. Anyway, but I'm gonna ask this because I didn't do it last time. Could you give a short little bio of yourself? Like what's going on in John's world?
Story short, I have an undergrad degree in theology, and I'm pursuing a master's degree in philosophy. After the semester, I'll be halfway done with my master's in philosophy, and I'm hoping to graduate in May of 2025 with a master's degree in philosophy from Holy Apostles Seminary. And I'm hoping afterwards to pursue a second master's in philosophy, not sure from where yet, but with an emphasis in analytic philosophy. And after that, hopefully a doctoral program. But that's the long story short. And
the road, yeah.
A lot of other stuff there. I like coffee. I really like things.
He was the barista at undergrad, and everyone knows. Like I'll ask a friend, like, so you know my friend John, like, oh yeah, the coffee guy or whatever. I'm like, yeah.
Yes. I love coffee, philosophy, Stranger Things, a whole bunch of other stuff. But that's the basic introduction.
That's a good combination. Well, so today we're going to be kind of hopefully trying to discuss the problem of evil if this thing does not stop in the middle of it.
We've been experiencing the problem of evil just to get to this podcast.
This is an argument against God's existence, right?
God is all-powerful. Technical difficulties should not exist. Technical difficulties exist.
Therefore, God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Theism is dismantled. Thank you, Zoom and Riverside, for proving God's non-existence. Wow.
Riverside just dunked on theism.
So. Craig has no chance. Anyway, so the problem of evil generally, I guess I'll give someone a little overview, and Don can give more of an overview, then we're going to kind of go into a specific category of it. So the problem of evil is something like there's a perfect being out there, and if there's a perfect being out there, you might expect this perfect being to create a world with goodness in it as a world with a lot of badness, right? So it's kind of strange. We wouldn't expect this world if a God that was perfect existed, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of bad things that happen, like the Holocaust, like the Zoom meeting situation. Anyway, so yeah.
And I'll add some more to that. So a basic formulation of the problem of evil would be, if God exists, evil would not exist. Evil exists, therefore God does not exist. So what are the defenses of these premises? So let's first get a definition of God on the table. We could say that God is a maximally great being, or as Anselm said, the greatest conceivable being. And
with all the omnis,
omnipresent, it's all good, all of that jazz. Yeah. And with that in mind, let's think about evil. So if God's all powerful, then he has the power to stop all evil. If God is all good, he would not want there to be evil. And if God is all knowing, he would know how to prevent any and all evil.
Yep.
There's just a problem. Evil exists. So if evil exists, the basic formulation I gave seeks to create a logical tension. So if evil exists, maybe God doesn't have power to stop all evil. Or God doesn't have all knowledge to know how to stop all evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or God isn't good. And that's why evil exists.
Maybe he doesn't care to stop
Maybe he doesn't care. If he doesn't have the power to stop all evil, then he's not omnipotent. If he doesn't know how to stop all evil or how to prevent all evil, then he's not omniscient. And if he doesn't want to stop all evil or stop any evil, not all good. And so if what you're calling God is not omnipotent, omniscient, or omnibenevolent,
not God,
then it's not even worth being called God. And so the problem of evil that I laid out, or the formulation that I laid out, is sometimes called a logical problem of evil. And the logical problem of evil is trying to demonstrate that evil's existence, any kind of evil, is incompatible with the existence of God. There would literally be a logical contradiction. To say that God exists and evil exists is the equivalent of saying there are married bachelors. And for some people, even in philosophical literature today, there are formulations of the logical problem of evil that people find sufficiently strong. I believe Graham Oppy has one. I think Eric Wielenberg has one. The first formulation that I can think of the logical problem of evil was from the philosopher J.L. Mackie back in the 1950s. But in response to Mackie's logical problem of evil, the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga wrote or defended what he called the free will defense. And he said it's logically possible that there are no worlds where creatures who have, libertarian freedom, or he said it's logically possible that God could not have made a world with creatures who have libertarian free will who would never abuse that free will. So he said it's logically possible that in any possible world, all creatures with libertarian free will would freely choose to do evil. And he also defended something that's called skeptical theism. And skeptical theism says if just because we don't know what God's reasons are for allowing evil doesn't mean that he doesn't have one. And so what Plantinga, making these moves, what he wanted to challenge was the logical incompatibility of evil's existence and God's existence. And in Plantinga's estimation, if you could prove, or if you could even, if it was even possible that God had morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil, then the logical problem of evil loses its power, loses its sting. Now,
and side note, I might add here, I think it's important in his larger framework because he's famous for the modal ontological argument.
Oh yeah,
right.
Same.
Says that like if it's possible God exists, therefore God exists. So as soon as you remove logical barriers in the way of God's existence, you can get off the ground possibility, which can get off the ground theism. Right. So I think this is kind of an important move in his worldview.
That's an important move, but also think about what Plantinga is saying, or think about Mackie's claim, who famously wrote, I think it's called, I think maybe it's called God and Omnipotence. I can't remember the exact name of his article, but when he was writing his logical argument from evil, it's a very bold claim. He's saying that there is no possible world that exists where God and evil are compatible. He wasn't saying that there aren't some worlds where God and evil are incompatible. He was saying that every single possible world, God's existence and evil's existence are incompatible. And that's a very, very, very bold claim and a very strong claim to say that there's no possible world where God and evil can coexist. Now, there are philosophers who believe that you can defend logical problems of evil. There's a book that came out by James Sturba not too long ago. I believe Graham Oppy and Eric Wielenberg have written defenses of logical problems of evil. There's a myth in philosophy that Alvin Plantinga completely killed the logical problem of evil. I don't believe that personally. I just don't think that the logical problem of evil is the strongest formulation of the problem of evil. And with that said, I want to turn my attention to the formulation of the problem of evil that I think is a bit stronger than the logical problem of evil, that being the evidence problem of evil. And as I said before, the logical problem of evil makes a bold claim that God's existence and the existence of evil are impossible in any possible world. The evidential argument of evil is far more modest.
Might I add something
Sure.
quick? Yeah, okay. So we're going to be having a debate next week, actually. And I'm not going to spoil too much, but John kind of gets into an argument about perfect being theism and imperfection and how the imperfection gets into this universe, right? So I think I can imagine a different kind of logical problem of evil where it's kind of like you have a perfect being, but there's imperfection in the world. It seems like if you have a perfect being, it's not even the kind of thing that could give rise to imperfection. And all of a sudden you have a different kind of logical problem of evil. And
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And save the rest of that for next week. That's
Yeah.
why, as a note, I've heard different apologists and different philosophers say that Plantinga killed the logical problem of evil. I'm not convinced that he did. I think that Flanagan's free will defense and I think that skeptical theism give good pushback to the logical problem of evil. Having said all that, I do think the evidential problem of evil is a bit stronger. And with that, one of the strengths or one of the things I find strong about the evidential problem from evil or evidential argument from evil is that it's not trying to say that evil and God's existence are logically incompatible. Rather, God's existence and evil, or rather, the existence of evil makes it unlikely that God exists.
You wouldn't predict evil.
You wouldn't predict evil or gratuitous evil. I'll get into what gratuitous evil is. The logical or the evidential argument of evil is trying to say that if gratuitous evil exists, you wouldn't expect God to exist, or would make it unlikely that God exists.
Yeah, so I'm interested in the gratuitous evil. I know we actually just did this on the last podcast, but I'm still interested. So, so I guess gratuitous evil.
Sure, a gratuitous evil would be an instance of evil that serves no greater purpose. An example would be, and a trigger warning for the audience, we'll be talking about child suffering, child death. Imagine an earthquake happening in a major city. Imagine a child trapped under the rubble. They're slowly suffocating. They're slowly being crushed to death by the rubble. They're crying out for help. Perhaps they're even praying. Nobody hears them. And then they die from either suffocation, they die from being crushed to death, and they also die alone, afraid in the dark, in horrible agony. Now, when I paint a picture like that, or when we think of other instances like that, I think intuitively we all think to ourselves, that's pointless. An evil is pointless. An evil like that serves no greater good. Indeed, we wouldn't even want it to serve a greater good if we could imagine one. And that's what gratuitous evil would be, or gratuitous instances of evil, that when we look at them, intuitively, we think to ourselves, this evil serves no greater good. And the evidential argument from evil seeks to say, if gratuitous suffering exists, it's highly unlikely that God exists. And I think this is a strong argument. For if we stop and think about it a moment, theism commits us to saying, as I said before, that God is all-powerful, all good, all loving, all the omnis. If God exists and is all these things, I think we wouldn't. It seems intuitively obvious that we wouldn't expect to see gratuitous suffering. Maybe some suffering, some evils, but gratuitous suffering would seem highly unlikely, if not impossible. And so those are two arguments from evil: the logical problem from evil, the evidential argument from evil. Now, I think, and you could also formulate the evidential argument from evil in a logical way and say, well, they're all logical arguments, obviously, but you could formulate it like the logical problem of evil and say, if gratuitous suffering exists, God does not exist. Gratuitous suffering exists, therefore God does not exist.
So here's something. So I actually went to lunch with my friend James, and I just did the podcast with on God and morality. Went to lunch with him yesterday, and we were talking a little bit about the problem of evil and skeptical theism and stuff. And like he presented this kind of thought, and I want to know what you make of this, right? So he has trouble with saying what a mind would do, right? It seems relevantly different from something that's non-minded, right? It seems like it's easier to make predictions about what maybe a physical thing would do, like maybe like what a tree would do. If you take an acorn and you plant it, you can predict it's going to grow into a tree, right? But with a human mind, it seems a little bit less deterministic, a little bit harder to predict. So it seems like as soon as we start making claims about what a mind would do, we're already on shaky ground. So how would you respond to that?
So when he uses that example, is he saying that to motivate skeptical theism that we're hard pressed to know what a mind like God's mind would do, like what he would allow or not allow?
Yeah, so I don't want to directly speak for him because I'm not exactly sure what his view is, but it would be something like we should be a little wary when we say that God would not allow evil, right? Because it's like, well, how do we exactly know what a mind would do? Maybe we have general ideas about what he would do, like create
Well,
a universe that is
I'll,
valuable.
well,
You
well, the pushback I would give is theists typically will say that either that God is a source of morality or that God is a source of our moral knowledge, however you want to cash that out. I'm not going to get into that debate. But let's say that God is a source of at least of our moral intuitions. We have moral intuitions about child suffering, war, disease, famine, fill in the blank. We know intuitively that these evils are wrong. And we know intuitively that if we knew someone had the power, a human agent. Actually, let me give a really good example.
okay.
William Lane Craig had a debate with, I think his name was, it was something Senate, maybe Lewis Senate Armstrong, a philosopher from Duke. And they had a debate on the problem of evil like 20 years ago. And this philosopher, again, I wish this name didn't escape me, but he gave an example of imagine if parents were going out, on a date for dinner. And they imagine these parents ask their neighbor to look after their kids, go, hey, they're older, they're 11, 12, you don't need to babysit them, but, maybe just every hour on the hour, just knock on the door, make sure they're okay, make sure they're not getting into any trouble, and then we'll be back in, 2 to 3 hours after our date. And as the thought experiment goes on, the parents get back from the date, and there are police and the fire department at the house. And the house is completely burned to the ground. The children sadly died in the fire. And the parents go up to their neighbor and they go, what happened? And the neighbor goes, well, I knew the house was on fire, but I had morally sufficient reasons. Not
Yeah.
intervening. I had morally sufficient reasons for not getting the kids out of the fire, even though I had the power to get them out, even though I knew that the fire was happening.
Yeah. And even though you wanted the kids to survive,
even though I wanted the kids to survive, I had morally sufficient reasons for letting them die in the fire. We would look at that person with our intuitions would say there's something horribly wrong in this scenario.
I think specifically we might ask the person, what are those morally sufficient reasons?
I don't even think we would ask that. I think we would say that just the fact alone, they had the power and they chose not to, would be just evil. And all of that to say, I think our intuitions are reasonably reliable enough for us to be skeptical about the claim, well, we don't know what a mind would do.
So I might give a little bit of pushback here, right? So imagine this person, this babysitter, right? They have given to charity every month for the past 20 years. They've been a public service. They've been in the police force for 30 years or something. They've been nothing but a servant, and they've been nothing but loving to you and your family, right? And now imagine, take the scenario where it happens, right? It would still be like, give me the morally sufficient reason. Why would you say you have morally sufficient reasons and not give me what it is? But it's like we at least have some justification to think that maybe they do, right? Like, I mean, because everything else points to the fact that they're actually a good person, right? So, and then as long as we add on the additional part where maybe she has more sufficient reasons for not saying what those sufficient reasons are, right? Then all of a sudden we have kind of a theodicy as to why this babysitter allowed this horrible incident to happen.
I'll pull the philosophy move and just say I don't share that intuition.
Oh my gosh!
And
well,
I
honestly, where I'm going with it, there's at least some.
I see where you're going, and I can't speak for your friend James. You can't speak for your friend James. But if his intuitions are the ones that you roughly stated, I would just say that, in my estimation, I just don't share his intuitions.
Well, so okay, I was going to bring this point up earlier as well, and I think I've been thinking about this too. I think there's two kinds of skeptical theisms. There's one where it's basically like we don't have intuitions about what a god would do, and I think that one's going to be a little bit problematic because all of a sudden our belief that God, it's permissible or it's not permissible for God to kill babies or something, that belief is going to be false, and then that's going to have a corrosive effect probably on our moral intuitions. So you can have that kind of skeptical theism where it's like, well, we don't even know, like we don't have moral access to it. But then there's a different kind of moral of.
I think the strong of skeptical theism would be a skeptical theism that's rooted in phenomenal conservatism. And phenomenal conservatism is the thesis that says, if it seems to S that P in the absence of the defeaters, S is justified in believing that P. And that's fancy language for saying, in the absence of reasons to doubt your experience, you're justified in trusting your experience or beliefs. Now, how does this apply to skeptical theism? Suppose one has warrant for believing that God knows something that they don't know, or that there are things that knowledge that would be
This would be the second kind of skeptical theism.
There would be knowledge that God has access to that I, as a finite agent, don't have access to. In the absence of reasons to doubt that, then I'd be justified in believing in skeptical theism or something along those lines. I think that's probably the days where I consider skeptical theism a live option. That would be the form that I would go with, because it's not saying that we can't know anything that God would do, or we can't have any, we can't make any prediction about what a perfect being would do. This is just saying that there are bits of knowledge that if God is omniscient, he has access to, that I don't have access to.
Yeah, and so it might have some kind of like ad hoc cost though. So I guess if we apply this to the girl who's suffering, or the child that's suffering and dying underneath the rubble or whatever, I guess this kind of justification would say something like, well, maybe someone secretly saw it and then their lives changed from it and a greater good was achieved. That might be a kind of theodicy that runs with this kind of skeptical theism. Then all of a sudden the theory is more ad hoc, and it's going to be kind of
the cost skeptical theism has its place, I believe, in the problem of evil, but I don't think it should be used to defeat the evidential problem of evil, because oftentimes when skeptical theism is trotted, actually maybe I should define skeptical theism. We used it a couple times.
I think people pretty much know what it means by now.
Basically, skeptical theism is an approach to the problem of evil to say, just because we don't know what God's reasons are for allowing evil doesn't mean that he doesn't have reasons for allowing evil.
Yeah.
And skeptical theism is sometimes used as a way of countering the evidential problem from evil. And they'll say something like this: well, it may appear gratuitous, or like an instance of suffering may appear to be gratuitous to us, but from God's perspective, God could have reasons for allowing that evil, and just because we don't have access to those reasons, or because we don't have access to those reasons, therefore we are unjustified in making the claim that this instance of evil is gratuitous. Though it appears gratuitous to us on the surface, God may have reasons for allowing that evil, or know why that evil occurred, and we just may not have the epistemic access to God's reasons for allowing that evil. And because we don't have that kind of access, it is unwise for us to claim, or unwarranted for us to claim, that evil is gratuitous.
Yeah.
And I think that comes at a cost, because I think God designed our intuitions to track with the truth. And when I gave the example of the girl suffering under the rubble, I think intuitively it just seems obvious that something like that, like a tragedy like that, or an instance of evil like that, serves no larger purpose, that it is pointless. And the cost of skeptical theism would be, at least when with regards to the evidential argument from evil, in my estimation, and there are much smarter people than me who defend skeptical theism as a response to the evidential problem from evil, the cost to me would seem that we have to doubt our most basic moral intuitions when it comes to thinking about instances of horrific suffering. And I think that's a cost that's too high it's or to quote William Lane Craig, I think the intellectual price tag for that is too high for me.
Yeah. Well, I
I
mean, yeah. So the kind of way I think about it, I mean, like maybe it wouldn't have a corrosive effect on moral intuitions if we go the direction where it's like, if there was justification, our intuitions would be in line with it. We just don't know what the justification is. I can see that route being taken, but that also has corrosive effects because it feels like parody might be something like if someone's presenting an argument against naturalism. If someone's like, well, we have this weird thing called fine tuning or whatever, and it's like, well, what could explain this? Surely not a naturalistic mechanism. And then maybe the naturalist says something like, well, maybe there's some kind of law outside of our universe that explains this in some way. All of a sudden, it's like we're appealing to things outside of our experience. It starts to feel very ad hoc, and theory
and
becomes intense
and
and difficult.
no, and I would agree. And our initial intuition, nothing is more obvious to us than our initial intuition about the instant or the example I gave of the child suffering under the rubble.
Yeah.
What seems more obvious to us, or at least to you, to me, that instance of suffering was pointless, or that God had a morally sufficient reason and we shouldn't think it was pointless.
Yeah.
And now it could be true that skeptical theism is true. No,
I should. Okay, you go. You go. You go.
let me say this. I'm not committed to saying that gratuitous evil exists. But having said that, I think one could be committed to the existence of gratuitous evil and still believe that God exists. That's
Yeah.
why I don't think skeptical theism is necessary for answering the evidential problem from evil. I actually think you could bite the bullet of premise one and say that gratuitous evil is compatible with God's existence. And and with that in mind, I think if you're ready, I want to maybe try to tentatively present what my theodicy is.
Okay. Well,
Unless,
I might add one more thought,
sure,
and then after that, we can perhaps shelf this for another time. But I think it would be a good conversation to have about like the defeasibility of the of our seemings of phenomenal conservatism, right? Because I mean, it does seem like there's a difference between a mere seeming and an intuition, right? So maybe intuitions can be seemings, but not all seemings are intuitions, right? So when I think about an intuition, I think of my eyesight is perceiving the world, right? I kind of intuit truth about reality. Like there's this lamp in front of me, there's this iPad in front of me, all of this stuff. That's kind of a direct intuition in the strictest sense. A seeming might be something like you see someone dying on the side of the road. It's like, if a God exists, like, how could this be justified? It just doesn't seem to me to be justified. It's not like an intuitive thing, right? So with intuitions, those aren't really that defeasible because it's like direct access to reality. But with seemings, I feel like if we had arguments to the contrary that kind of got off the ground, it could easily be, not easily, but because there's strength to it, but they could be defeasible and they could be shaved off.
no, that's fair. And I don't want to get into the grounds of when should you trust your seemings versus when should you not trust your seemings, because the
Yeah,
this could say, well, if God enters into the equation and he has omniscience and he knows the end from the beginning, then I can see why some skeptical theists aren't moved by the evidential problem from evil. They just aren't moved by the claim that gratuitous suffering exists. But I don't share that intuition,
yeah.
because when I look at the suffering of a child under rubble after an earthquake, I just it seems true to me that serves no greater purpose.
Okay, so you have a theodicy for the problem of gratuitous suffering.
So
Please.
I have a theodicy that seeks to say that, or seeks to modestly try to show that God's existence is compatible with gratuitous suffering.
Okay, I'm very interested because I actually don't see a way around this. It's actually kind of like a really convincing argument for me, I guess. So yeah.
Sure. The theodicy that I want to present is sometimes called a free process theodicy. But before I lay out what the theodicy states, I want to lay out the foundation for this argument. And I think Kirk McGregor, he's a Christian philosopher. He wrote a book on Molinism, and he also wrote a article. What's it called? It's like the existence and irrelevance of gratuitous suffering, or something like that, defending the compatibility of gratuitous suffering with God's existence. Anyway, in McGregor's book on Molinism, he has a very short section dedicated to the problem of evil, and he lays out a defense in that book for why he thinks gratuitous suffering is compatible with God's existence. And he starts by saying, if we think about who God is, if God exists, God is necessary, God is perfect, God lacks nothing. If God were to create, anything that God creates would by definition not be perfect. If God is the only being who can be necessary, the only being who could be perfect, then that means necessarily anything that God creates would not share in that perfection. It would be contingent. It might be good, it might be really good, but it would be something by necessity that wouldn't be perfect, because only God and only God is perfect, because God and only God is necessary. And McGregor argues in the book, if God were to create, he believes that natural disaster, natural evil, and by natural evil I mean things like earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, would kind of be baked into the equation. Because if God were to create even a good creation, because that creation isn't necessary, he argues that we can expect to see things like earthquakes emerge, or hurricanes emerge, or tornadoes emerge, because they may be good, but it's not perfect. And he develops it further by saying, I'll get into what the free process theodicy seeks to say. He also argues, if God wants human beings to have libertarian free will, if he wants human beings to have the freedom to grow and develop in moral character, McGregor argues, if you take the fact that creation isn't perfect and that God wants creatures to have libertarian free will, he believes if you take these things together and also insert that God, in order to preserve our free will, would act or would choose to be at an epistemic distance from creation, meaning that God is not actively intervening in creation. He argues that we could expect to see both gratuitous natural evil and gratuitous moral evil. If creation is not, if it's good but if it's not perfect, then you could have things like if God is designed, let's say, the laws of nature, you know, the water that can quench your thirst can also drown you. The fire that can warm you can also burn you. If God creates these laws of nature, but also if God creates these laws of nature, but they're not perfect, they're good. But if God is also operating at an epistemic distance, McGregor believes, and other philosophers like him, that suppose God sees that because, creation isn't perfect, like something like a tectonic plate starts shifting, an earthquake might start to develop in, fill in the blank, San Francisco. McGregor believes that God has the power to stop that earthquake. But if God wants to operate at an epistemic distance and respect the human freedom, human libertarian freedom, and also respect creation as well, respect the integrity of creation operating in a law-like way, McGregor believes that God is going to, in a sense, operate from a distance or take a hands-off approach and allow nature to do its thing and allow human agents to do their thing. And if that is the case, if nature is operating freely in a law-like way, and if humans have libertarian freedom, and if God is operating at an epistemic distance, McGregor and other philosophers like him believe that that can reasonably predict the existence of gratuitous natural evil and gratuitous moral evil. And I'll develop the free process side of things more. William Hasker, in a book, 5 Views of the Problem of Evil, talks about, suppose God wanted to create a world with moral agents with free will, and he wanted to create a world with laws of nature that operate in a law-like way that don't require God's constant intervention. Hasker believes if such a world exists, we would expect to see gratuitous natural evils, just like McGregor. Like McGregor adds the epistemic distance part, where God operates at an epistemic distance. And I want to combine Hasker's theodicy with McGregor's and say two things. If God is operating at an epistemic distance, he wants creation to operate in a law-like way. He wants humans to have libertarian free will, and also creation isn't perfect because it's not God. I believe if you take those 4 theses together, or 4 propositions together, that God wants creation to operate in a law-like way, humans have libertarian free will, God is operating at an epistemic distance to respect human freedom, and creation by definition can't be perfect because it's not God, I believe that you can reasonably predict the existence of gratuitous natural evil and gratuitous moral evil. Why would it predict gratuitous natural evil? Well, God could see that an earthquake's about to happen. But if God, well, we won't even talk about earthquakes. Let's talk about fire, for instance. If God wanted humans to have free will, he wanted us to have agency, and he also wanted creation to operate in a law-like way, imagine if God intervened every time before a person stuck their hand in a fire.
Yeah.
It would be a very strange world. Our actions wouldn't have consequences. Nature wouldn't operate in a law-like way. You'd have a major problem of induction.
Yeah, you wouldn't
Because
have science. Yeah.
you couldn't have science at all. You couldn't make future testable predictions, because imagine if every time a child fell off a bike, God suspended the laws of gravity and had them float in air and safely floated them to the ground rather than them falling off the bike. This theodicy seeks to say that if God wants to preserve the integrity of the laws of nature that he designed to operate in a law-like way, but also, remember, they're not perfect because only God's perfect, and God also acted at epistemic distance to maintain the integrity of our libertarian free will, I believe it is reasonable, or you can reasonably predict that certain gratuitous evils will happen. And I believe you can predict that, earthquakes might happen for no other reason other than the fact that nature is operating in a law-like way and nature isn't perfect, and that God is operating at epistemic distance. And I believe, someone might go, why did God allow this earthquake to happen? And I think if you say God designed the laws of nature, but nature isn't perfect, and God is operating at epistemic distance, I believe that won't necessarily answer the question, why that earthquake? Rather, it'll say, this is why earthquakes in general happen.
Yeah.
So what theodicy seeks to do is not to answer the question, why a specific evil happens. Rather, it seeks to answer why evil exists at all, or why gratuitous suffering exists, or gratuitous evils exist at all. And so again, the four propositions are: God designed the laws of nature to operate in a law-like way. Humans have libertarian free will. God designed nature to operate in a law-like way. Nature isn't perfect because only God is perfect. God is operating at an epistemic distance to maintain human freedom. And what was the 4th proposition? And we'll just say those 3 for now. God designed nature to operate in a law-like way. Only God is perfect, therefore the laws of nature won't be perfect. And God operates at an epistemic distance to respect human freedom. I think if you keep those 3 propositions, or if you hold to all 3 of those propositions, I think you could reasonably predict that gratuitous evils exist. And I don't believe, if what I'm saying is true, I don't believe you have to give a story for every act, or a theodicy behind every evil that exists, or a reason behind every evil that exists. For instance, a tornado hits Oklahoma. Someone might ask, well, how could an all-loving and all-powerful God allow this to happen? What are the goods he's trying to pursue? I would say God isn't necessarily trying to pursue any good by allowing this tornado. This tornado just happened because nature is operating in a law-like way. Nature isn't perfect, and God is operating at an epistemic distance. Now, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that God isn't actively at work when evil happens. I do believe that when evil happens, God is at work to bring good out of that evil. What I'm saying is, I don't think God allowed that evil for some greater purpose, if that makes sense. Now, I've said a lot, but feel free to ask questions for clarification.
This is actually very okay. So me and John have had several conversations over the past just few years of just being friends and stuff. And like during the past summer, we talked about this exact argument, and I think you've developed it and refined it, and like because I feel like similar objections I had during the summer are harder to make now, and I can't pin it down. No, this is a very interesting. This is very interesting. So I have a few points written down here. I guess just kind of like a. It's not exactly an objection, but something to think about.
Sure.
A general. I mean, like you can have imperfect things, but they're not bad, right?
Yeah.
So it's like fire could only have the ability to warm you. Maybe it's impossible for it to burn you, right? This is an imperfect thing. It's not God. It's not necessary. And so I think that can be. So I can imagine a world where it's filled with imperfection, but like it's not filled with any amount of badness. And so that was just kind of one thought.
The pushback I would give on that is McGregor would argue, let's say that fire doesn't exist in some possible world. McGregor would argue, no matter what the laws of nature look like, because nature by definition isn't perfect, gratuitous evil is going to emerge in one way, shape, or form. It's going to, no matter how God designs the laws of nature, because we could imagine a world, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. We could imagine a possible world where there are no hurricanes or tornadoes. But I think McGregor's point is simply this: no matter what possible world exists, if God makes it and designs the laws of nature, because that natural world isn't God, it's going to have the possibility of gratuitous evil baked into the equation, if that makes sense.
So the possibility of it, so that maybe we can make a
or actually not even possibility. Sorry,
it won't necessitate it. That's for certain, right? So like there's no necessitating thing going on.
Or say gratuitous evil, or I actually would go as far as to say that gratuitous evil would be necessarily baked into the cake, because eventually, unless God is actively stopping nature from ever going awry, then I believe because it's not God, because it's by definition not perfect, some form of gratuitous natural evil is going to occur.
That does feel very contingent to me, but I think you can make a necessary thing here. I think I was thinking like if it's possible that there be gratuitous suffering, that's bad, right? So like the mere and the necessarily perhaps you can get the necessity of the possibility off the ground, and then all of a sudden like there's necessarily something bad, that of the possibility of there being badness, right? So like that was something I was anyway.
Sure.
Yeah. So okay. So I wonder if this is it's actually such a good theodicy from what I'm hearing. I think maybe the person who wants to maintain this kind of argument, like a gratuitous suffering, might have to make a different move. I think maybe you could just argue from the quantity of it, right? So when it comes to science, that was actually really good. So one of the strengths of this theodicy is how do I word this? Like basically the point was if God intervenes too much, all of a sudden we don't have the good predictability, and I think that is a good. I think scientific inquiry is good, and I think it's a thing.
It helps. We live in a rational cosmos, and that's a good thing.
Yes, yeah, and God want that.
Nature
Yeah.
and nature is we're capable of making rational inquiry into nature. That's science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so here's the thing. I don't think an occasional intervention would dismantle the success of science, right? You know what I mean? So like it's one of those things where it's like if we had this kid, like on the earthquake or whatever, and it's suffering on, it's like maybe like you wouldn't, especially since no one saw it, especially since there was no scientific community to observe the situation happening. It's like God can kind of work in the shadows here, where it's like, yeah, okay, so now we're going to save this child, we're going to like raise it to life. No one knew anything else, and maybe he covers it up, where it's like no one could in the future even look back into the past and discover it in some way. Like maybe he just covers the whole thing up in this secretive situation to preserve the success of science. Right? I can imagine this kind of thing happening.
It's not even. It is the success of science is part of it, but it's also a rational world, and a world that has consequences built into it. So perhaps that child in the scenario you gave, you know, they think they can just start being reckless with their bike, that they can start, you know, taking their bike to a cliffside edge and riding off
Oh, okay.
because God is going to intervene every single time. Like, not to make this a Christian theodicy, but it reminds me of the story when Jesus was tempted by Satan, and Satan says, "Well, if you're the Son of God, throw yourself off this, temple tower, or throw yourself off the roof of the tower."
Yeah,
And
God
my
saved you. Yeah.
yeah, maybe my pushback would be, if God did that, it wouldn't just hurt the success of science. It would mean that we as moral agents, I think our moral responsibility would be compromised in some ways, or our moral development as well, and our rationality would be compromised as well.
I suppose a naturalistic theodicy might be something like, God makes them forget or something.
I that to me, I
But
haven't thought.
I think there's like maybe negative that does kind of remove some amount of freedom. So there's kind of like a.
And again, like I said, the other part of this is that God is operating at an epistemic distance. That's the other aspect of this. But if you want, I could talk about how I think this also can address the problem of divine hiddenness as well, not just the problem of gratuitous suffering. Unless you have any further questions.
I do.
Sure. Yeah.
Really, I'm gonna think about this more. But here's something that I kind of wrote down. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. Like, and maybe this is like physically impossible, but like, don't like all the scientists listening to this, just be charitable with me, okay? So, imagine God creates fire, but it only warms and it doesn't burn, right? So like, now imagine all natural phenomenons like this, and he operates at an epistemic distance where everything operates like the fire. It only warms. So, in other words, I was actually thinking about it in terms of fine tuning. It's kind of like maybe God fine tuned the universe, but he didn't fine tune it enough, right? So maybe there's still work to be done, right? Maybe he could fine tune it such that physical phenomenon isn't as dangerous as it is. Like it just seems maybe gratuitously dangerous. It doesn't seem like you can preserve human freedom. You can preserve the freedom of the laws of nature. You can preserve all of these things, but like just make it a little bit less dangerous. Don't have the burn part of the warm fire.
And I would say that what you're describing is actually heaven.
Okay. So why aren't we in heaven, John? Why not be in heaven?
That's
like what goods can be, because like if we live in a world of gratuitous natural evil because of this argument, then like and that's impermissible, like with the negative connotation to it.
good that comes from this, and this is I guess intuitions will just vary. Hasker argues that perhaps gratuitous evils, a world with gratuitous evil, or a world with natural gratuitous evils, perhaps such a world is the only world where we can develop freely as moral agents. Perhaps in a world where there is no natural evil whatsoever, or the world that you're describing, we wouldn't be able to grow and develop as moral agents. Because our actions would never have consequences. Again, thinking about your scenario of the child, constantly throwing themselves off their bike because they know God's going to intervene. if you're going to have a world that is truly indeterministic, both in a sense that, you know, the laws of nature are operating freely and humans have libertarian freedom and they're acting freely, I struggle to imagine a world where somehow, some way, gratuitous evil isn't going to emerge. And I guess this may be a difference in intuitions on that part.
So I'm trying to construct a thought experiment. I see what you're saying, and I think if I can construct a really effective thought experiment, maybe it would work, right? So like, this isn't going to be a good one, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. So like, let's say our friend Ben, not that we have a friend named Ben, but just saying like a friend named Ben. Let's say that let's say he was attracted to a certain kind of person, okay? And we took this person. I may actually forget the point I'm trying to make. I hope I can make this work. Anyway, so Ben's attracted to a certain kind of person, and we find this certain kind of person, and we actually put this person in Ben's proximity, right? And we've actually kind of created a situation where Ben freely chooses to date this person, right? So like we didn't force him to date this person, but we've created the situation to where he maybe raised the probability of him choosing to engage in some amount of goodness, right? That of a good relationship, right? So like I don't think God would be taking away our freedom if he just made the laws of nature better, right?
Here's the problem. The
And well,
pushback
so
that I would give is,
I need to tack on a super quick thing, and maybe he can strategically place obstacles so that we would overcome them. That doesn't mean he takes away our freedom, right? That was the tack, that the added on tack thing.
well, here's the pushback that I'll give. You could go one of two routes. You could go the McGregor route and say, no matter how good the laws of nature are, if they're not God, and if God is not going to intervene, if God is going to operate at an epistemic distance, some way, somehow, no matter what the possible world looks like, gratuitous evil is going to emerge by necessity. Because of those two things, nature is imperfect and God is operating at an epistemic distance. If that's true, no matter what the possible world is, I think that gratuitous evil is just going to emerge, no matter how good the laws of nature are. If you take these two things together in conjunction, that the laws of nature will never be God, and that God is operating at an epistemic distance, I think necessarily, no matter what possible world we find ourselves in, gratuitous evil is going to emerge.
I think what really matters here is predictability. I think that's actually, this whole argument actually, in a weird way, hinges on the value of the predictability of science, right? Because like I was actually going to raise an objection. I was going to say something like, well, what if God created a world where like, you know, he strategically like created situations where like, you know, you could like avoid, you know, you could face obstacles here and then face obstacles there, and then like, but I guess like too much of that, it would just, we would live in an unpredictable world and we would actually like lose the good of scientific discovery. Even if
We
it
lose
was
a good
law, like so even if it was law like even if like law like doesn't entail a consistency, right? You know, he can still operate from an epistemic distance, but I think consistency is what really matters here, like predictability. And anyway,
but
that's just, yeah.
does God want a real world that has risks, that has the possibility of love, or does he want a simulation? And
Yeah.
does he want nature to operate like a simulation? Does he want human agents to operate like a simulation? Or does he want there to be genuine give and take in nature and also in human agents? And I guess intuitions will vary on that.
I really like this argument. I want to like think about it more, and because like I might use it if the problem of evil comes up next week. I might use the theodicy on you. But yeah, no, that's
But let me say, before we talk about hiddenness, let me say what I think some of
yeah,
the cash value
yeah. I think
of
all my
this
thoughts are
theodicy.
pretty much out. So yeah, you go. Yeah,
Some oftentimes when tragedy strikes, people of faith Let me take a few steps back. People will look at the tragedy and go, why did God allow this evil to happen? In 2004, there was a massive tsunami. Actually, I'll use a different example. Let's use Hurricane Katrina in the United States back in I think
I can't help but
2005.
think of the meme. I'm sorry. Anyway, continue.
No, but people ask the question, why did God allow this hurricane that caused the death of so many people? And there are people like, religious people of good faith. They don't mean anything. They're not trying to be unethical or heartless or emotionless in what I'm about to say. They would say things like, well, God wants to develop our character, or just because we don't know what God's reasons are for allowing this doesn't mean he doesn't have good reasons. And to me, it comes across as, God's kind of running the cost benefit analysis, and he threw in, Hurricane Katrina just, to build the character of certain people,
Yeah.
or fill in the blank. But what my theodicy would say is, Hurricane Katrina happened because hurricanes happen in a world where nature is operating in a law-like way freely. God's operating at an epistemic distance, and nature is imperfect. And sometimes devastating hurricanes just happen. But I believe, and this is something that's an addition to the theodicy, it's not the theodicy it's itself. As a Christian, I believe that God is actively working in all tragedy that takes place. He's actively trying to redeem all tragedy that takes place. The Christian or an aspect of the Christian message is that God is working all things together for good to them that love him and them are called according to his purpose. So I believe that God works with undetermined outcomes, such as, natural, moral, gratuitous evils and gratuitous moral evils from human agents. And I believe he works with these undetermined outcomes to bring about a good. But the difference in this theodicy is that God didn't bring about these evils to bring about the good. It's that he brings about the good in spite of the evils.
I like that. So it preserves like the kind of thing you want to say, where it's like, well, it's actually kind of good this happened in my life because I get to learn from it. So you get to preserve that. But
you get to preserve that, but you don't have to say the evil is in any way necessary.
You can have your cake and eat it too.
Because there are oftentimes there are people who talk about, well, I needed to have this evil, or this evil was good. And in some way they minimize unintentionally. And I'm not trying to take away, people have incredible stories where they've overcome great suffering. And I'm not trying to minimize that. But at the same time, I don't want anyone to have to be committed to saying that this evil had to happen to me.
Or that it was good that it happened, or something like that.
It was good that it happened. I think my theology allows you to have a revulsion at evil and go, this wasn't necessary. This didn't have to happen. But also you can be committed to saying that good has come about through this.
And it doesn't, like, it's not skeptically theistic. So, like, you don't have the ad hoc problems, and you don't have the intuitive problems and everything.
The only problem that happens, well, there are obviously skeptics will get pushed back, and that's fine. But one of the major issues that I see, at least if you're like a Christian or a Muslim or Jewish, if you believe that God performs miracles, that becomes a problem, because you have instances where, God will part a Red Sea to rescue the Israelites from the free moral evil of the Egyptians, or God will raise the dead, in Jesus's ministry, and other things like that. And it appears that he's not operating at an epistemic distance in those moments.
I just came up with a theodicy for that, like in my head. Like, I mean, I guess maybe.
No, this is where I'll call it. This is where I'll apply local skeptical theism, not global, but local skeptical theism, and say that God does have morally sufficient purpose or reasons for choosing to intervene in the times where he does intervene. And I don't think that has the same corrosive effect as like a global skeptical theism that you have to apply to all instances of evil. I think you can just there are certain times where God chooses to intervene, and I'm not sure why he does. And I think
Yeah,
that's
I mean, I was just thinking of like a theodicy. Like, again, I'm no historian, so I don't really know like how big some kind of scientific inquiry was back then. But I guess like maybe God doesn't intervene when scientific inquiry is at a high because he wants to preserve this kind of like investigation predictability thing. But if there's maybe a culture where there's not much science going on, like you might expect there to be a little more because no one's trying
yeah.
to.
But
Yeah,
also, if we
that
think
was.
about,
I like that.
but also if we think about what a miracle would be, like a miracle by definition, like or not by definition, but at least within the Christian faith, I don't want to speak for other religions. When God performs miracles in the Old and New Testament, there are specific instances where God does have a purpose for his
Yeah,
suspension of the laws of nature or for intervening. It's not something that happens all the time, because if it did,
yeah, yeah,
I would a problem of induction from miracles. So, at least within the Christian faith, God does have, if you believe in revelation and other things like that, you can reasonably you can be committed to the possibility of miracles, but also the reality that God doesn't always act miraculously. And I don't think it creates a skeptical worry for the whole of the theodicy, if that makes sense.
yeah. Before we get to divine hiddenness, because I know you want to talk about that, and so do I. I have one last kind of thing to say. It's like kind
Sure.
of an objection, but like I'll let you respond to it, and then we'll
Sure.
go on to the next part. So I mean, there's just kind of like I think with all problems of evil, like this objection seems like maybe one of the other ones. It's kind of like, well, why? Surely God doesn't have to allow this much, right? Like it's kind of like maybe there's kind of like a line where it's like, well, clearly he could have drawn the line at a different point. That there's vagueness in there where it's like, well, at what point should God draw the line? But like, I mean, I think at the very least, there could be a convincing argument from there's just too much of it. Like he could just like prevent at least some of it. Like, you know what I mean? In some way that doesn't, loosen the predictability of science. Like maybe he constructs the laws in such a way that maybe they actually respond to suffering. So like maybe there could be a law-like structure where, if there's too many, innocent children getting killed by earthquakes, the earthquake stops. Like maybe there's some kind of law-like thing, and you can predict that because every time maybe 53 kids dies, like every time the 54th almost dies, the earthquake stops, and all of a sudden you can have some predictability there. And so it would be weird and strange, but like, we're talking about God here.
My pushback would be what you said at the beginning about vagueness. I would want to know, like, how much evil would become too much evil. Like, is there a
Yeah.
certain amount of evil that God's allowed, or is this collapsing back into the logical problem of evil again, and saying that any and all evil would be too much for God to allow?
Yeah, and I don't want it to collapse into that,
and
I,
I would give pushback on magnitude, what they mean by how. I would ask how much is too much, and I think it could end up collapsing into a vagueness problem. But even if it didn't, I suppose if you wanted to go the route of skeptical theism in this scenario and go, perhaps there are no, or even actually not even skeptical theism, you could go the feasibility route from Plantinga and say, perhaps perhaps it's logically possible that such a world exists that you describe, but there isn't a
Mhm.
full world where the laws of nature operate in a law-like way and humans have freedom in the way they do. Perhaps such
Yeah,
a isn't feasible for God. Maybe it's logically possible, but in the type of world we live in, or in the actual world, the world that we are in, perhaps this is the only feasible world where we have laws of nature that are good but not perfect, and
yeah,
beings are able to operate freely with God respecting our freedom. Perhaps the world. So the answer would be perhaps such a world is logically possible but not feasible, and that's
yeah.
feel comfortable with that response.
Yeah, and I think actually the argument that I suggested is like it has some strength to it, but it's so much weaker than the other ones. I think like as long as you have evidence on the other side and the possibility of there being an answer, like you can
Like
do it.
Plantinga talk about this thing called transworld depravity, which is the belief that perhaps in any possible world where humans have libertarian free will at least one person's going to go wrong. At least one person's going to choose to do something evil. And perhaps you could say there's like, trans world natural evil, where perhaps in every single possible world, there's going to be some way in which nature is going to go awry and, lots of earthquakes are going to happen. Lots of hurricanes are going to happen. Lots of tornadoes. And it could just be that though we could logically conceive of a world like the one you described in your objection, perhaps such a world isn't feasible due to, trans nature depravity in all possible worlds.
So I actually apologize for this, but I actually want to give another objection before we get to divine hiddenness, because I just thought about this, and I've been thinking about this with respect to like philosophy of science and different things. And I actually, like a few weeks ago, I think I texted you and Steven. It was like an argument against deism. And I think that argument has some tools that I can use here. So, okay. So I can understand what it means for God to operate from epistemic distance from human action. Because we don't want God to be causing the humans to act. We don't want that to be happening, right? If we want to preserve free choice, the human is in some way the sole origin of this action, right? In some sense. It doesn't seem to be the case with natural phenomena, right? So, like, it actually, there's kind of a question about explanation, right? So it's like, if God exists, right, and he creates a universe and steps back from it, right, there's still like kind of an unexplained thing where it's like he creates the universe and natural phenomenon unfolds, and for any specific instance of natural phenomenon you can ask, well, why did this happen? Why are the laws this way in this particular instance? And the way to answer that is to say, well, God caused it to happen. But that would entail that God is divinely determining each instance, right? And actually, maybe if you want to get a robust version of the PSR off the ground and you want to make some kind of contingency argument or something, I really do think, to be consistent, you got to say that God is actively in the world causing each thing to happen. Maybe it's consistent, right? But he is still doing it. And I wonder if that's an objection that
That would
works.
be it would be an objection if perhaps you're trying to argue for maybe divine determinism, or you would say that if God exists, he has to actively be involved in all aspects of creation, or needs to be the
Or
explanation.
it would just be a better theory, because like there's actually a lot of unexplained stuff on the world where in the possible world where he creates and steps back.
It's not okay. Let me clarify. It's not that he's stepping back. He is still involved with creation, but he's not overwhelming like McGregor talks about. He's not overwhelming creation with his presence. We're about to get into the divine problem of divine
Yeah,
hiddenness.
yeah.
And
I'll let it swerve into there, and
and
then
so
yeah.
there's enough evidence to suggest, oh, why does nature operate in a law-like way? Oh, God must have designed the laws of nature. But I don't think one needs to be committed to say that God causes every act of, maybe he designed the laws of nature, but to say that he causes every time I drop, a penny on the ground, God is causing that act of,
Well, that's a free
the law.
choice, right? That's going to be relevantly different.
No, I'm
But
not talking about. No, I'm saying that. Well, let's say every time a stone falls,
yeah,
we could say that God designed the gravity to function in such a way, but I don't think one needs to be committed to say that God, because he designed gravity to operate in that way, that he caused that act of gravity to happen, if that makes
so
sense.
it actually falls under, like, I would be interested to do a podcast on this specific thing, because like it's a very particular metaphysical point, but I think it has very interesting implications. I think you can actually see, like, with absolute clarity, like not that you would be irrational if you rejected this, but I think you can see with like maybe some like logical clarity, like if God is the explanation for reality, he's the explanation for each part of reality, and that
Yeah, and
would be
that's
just
that's also why you have theistic determinists, who
yeah.
believe some way God is causing all things. I'm not committed to that. There are smart people who believe that. Rather, I'll illustrate. I talk about how God is the cause of human beings, but we are the cause of our actions. So God is the source, or God is the explanation for why humans are free, for why
Yeah.
humans can act freely. but he's not the explanation behind our choices. We are. So perhaps I could say that God is the explanation for the laws of nature, but he is not the explanation for why certain instantiations of the laws of nature happen.
Well, so my kind of response to that is that like free choices are just relevantly different, right? So like there's kind of like an explanation when a person makes a free choice, but like there's kind of a sense in which like if a natural phenomenon causes something to happen, obviously it didn't choose this thing to happen, and like there's kind of some unexplainedness there that's not in the free choice.
Well, if you're committed to teleology, if you believe that God designed nature to have specific ends that it's going to reach, but he doesn't have to intervene. Like if God designed the process to where he
Yeah.
doesn't have to specifically intervene in every single act, I believe that you can believe that, and
Yeah.
not committed to this idea that God has to be the cause of every instantiation of the laws of
Yeah.
nature.
Yeah, I think that would be a really interesting discussion another time. I think we should shelve that and then go to divine hiddenness
Yeah, no,
because like
what that would turn into is not necessarily an argument from evil, but a question of world I even described as even possible if God is omnipotent and if God is sovereign. You get into these questions of like, could a world like indeterministic world like that even exist if the God of the classic monotheistic faiths exists? Because some would say that the world that I even painted isn't even possible if
yeah.
something like classical theism is true. But that's a whole. That's a
Yeah. We can put that on the
that's,
shelf and look at it later.
that's a philosophical theology, coherence of theism, providence question that
Yeah.
when you're writing a paper, that is outside of the scope of this paper, outside the scope of this podcast.
Outside the scope. Okay, so what specific? Okay, so I guess before we get into it, so define what divine hiddenness is, and how it relates to the broader conversation.
Sure. So the problem of divine hiddenness, as far as I know, is an issue in the philosophy of religion that was first developed by the atheist philosopher of religion, J.L. Schellenberg, in the early 90s. And the problem with divine hiddenness, before I explain what it is, maybe I'll give an example of what it is.
Okay.
So the famous Catholic nun, Mother Teresa, she was known for doing great humanitarian work, great evangelistic and mission work for the Catholic Church. And when she died, her journal was discovered, and her journal was filled with prayers that caused a lot of people to pause and take a few steps back. Her journal was filled with prayers where she was begging God to make his presence known to her. Her journal was filled with prayers. She felt that God didn't exist, or if he did exist, he was distant from her, hidden from her. And so what Mother Teresa was experiencing is the phenomena of divine hiddenness, this idea of, if God does exist, why is it that people who are open to the proposition that God exists find themselves in a state of disbelief? The problem with divine hiddenness isn't talking about, no offense to internet atheists, people who are on the internet going, even if God did exist,
I would never worship him. I would spit in his face.
I was spitting in his face and say, I would never want to worship him. Or, we've all
Yeah.
met people who are strongly against religion, and I'm not trying to throw those people under the bus. But the problem with divine hiddenness is not addressing those people. The problem with divine hiddenness is addressing the real phenomena of people who seem to be committed to truth, committed to investigating the question, does God exist? And yet they find themselves in a state of disbelief. They may even want to believe that God exists. They may even want to believe that something like Christianity is true.
They might spend their lives investigating it and
They
still
might
fail.
even spend their lives investigating whether God exists or a certain religion's true. And yet they still find themselves in a state of disbelief. Now, there are a variety of approaches to the problem of divine hiddenness. It is a species of the problem of evil. Some will take the I won't say they'll take the skeptical theist route. Before I even go down skeptical theism, a common response and one that I find problematic is to say that the type of people I describe, people who are open to the existence of God but find themselves in a state of disbelief. Schellenberg, John L. Schellenberg, the founder of the divine hiddenness argument,
Non-resistant non-believers.
calls them non-resistant non-believers. They are non-believers who are not resistant to the reality of God or the existence of God. And where was I going with that? Oh, some theists attack the hiddenness argument and say, well, non-resistant non-believers just don't exist. All people who reject God's existence, all agnostics, all atheists, they're all they're
I
all
I might add the Christian plausibly. We don't have to go down this road, but might have to be committed to that because of Romans 1, right? And different passages.
sure,
You know. But
sure,
yeah,
and don't want to get into an exegesis of Romans
yeah, we
1,
don't have to go to
but
that.
there are certain religious apologists or religious philosophers who would say that they would just deny that non-resistant non-believers exist. And if they're right, there is no problem of divine hiddenness.
Yeah.
There's just there are just people who are rebelling against God's existence. Either they could do it subconsciously,
Yeah.
expressing the truth and unrighteousness. And I'll say this much: I don't hold that position, but there is something to be said for the position, and this is the one thing I'll say in its favor. All human beings are prone to self-deception. Sometimes we
Yeah.
think we're more virtuous than we actually are. Sometimes we think we're more selfless than we actually are, when in reality, we're selfish. We're pursuing vice. And so it is possible that certain people who think of themselves as non-resistant non-believers are, in fact, in some way, resistant non-believers. They just don't know it. And they're not intentionally trying to go about doing that. They're just in a state of self-deception.
That creates a different problem, I think, probably. But yeah.
That many conversations could come from that. But I still think there's an issue in saying that all instances of unbelief are resistance.
It's
Or
a pretty
all
claim. Yeah.
It's a pretty broad claim. And as one atheist YouTuber put it, he said, certain believers will tell you that they believe, or one of the reasons they believe in the resurrection of Jesus is on the basis of the reliability of testimony. They trust the testimony of the authors of Scripture. They trust the testimony of believers who told them that, Jesus lives in their heart. But these same believers don't trust the testimony of people who claim to be non-resistant non-believers.
Yeah.
They'll trust
That's interesting.
they'll say that testimony is generally reliable. They're like, yeah, you got to trust, in the absence of reasons to distrust the testimony of someone. Like for instance, imagine you and I were visiting a city that we'd never gone to. Imagine if we were in Auckland, New Zealand, and for whatever reason our phones just didn't work, and we were trying to find a cafe for lunch, and we knew the name of the cafe, but we didn't know what street it was on. So we approached someone on the street and we asked them, hey, do you know the directions to get to this cafe? And they're like, it's 2 blocks down the road, take a right and you'll find it. In the absence of any reasons to doubt that person's testimony, I believe that you and I would be justified in what they have to say about the location of the restaurant. Likewise, if a person says, I am a non-resistant non-believer, I've searched for God and I didn't find him. I'm open to the proposition that God exists, and yet at this point, I don't find myself in a state of belief. In the absence of reasons to doubt their testimony, I think you are warranted in trusting their testimony. And so because I have such a firm commitment to trusting testimony, I have I have a strong issue with the approach to divine hiddenness that says, well, all unbelievers are resistant unbelievers. So,
Yeah.
but I want to talk about how my theodicy actually predicts the reality of divine hiddenness. I'm
Okay.
not
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not I'm not going to try to address specific instances of hiddenness, and not because I'm trying to be dodgy, but just to try to show how my theodicy actually predicts hiddenness, or at least the reality of hiddenness, but also predicts another form of divine hiddenness, that being religious ambiguity. Um,
Oh
the,
my goodness, we
and
are spoiling next week's debate.
and so
Oh.
if God is operating at an epistemic distance, if his existence isn't always obvious because he wants to respect human freedom and respect the integrity of the laws of nature, just as I believe my first theodicy predicts and explains gratuitous evil, I think it also can predict and explain why divine hiddenness is a phenomenon. Because if the world is ambiguous in some ways because God is operating at an epistemic distance, I believe that you reasonably predict things like religious diversity existing. I believe you could predict people experiencing divine hiddenness because God's existence wouldn't always be obvious. Now, that doesn't necessarily explain certain pockets of divine hiddenness, like why does this person specifically, who's seeking out to see if God exists, why they experience hiddenness. My theodicy doesn't necessarily explain that, but I think what my theodicy does do is give an explanation for why hiddenness as a phenomena at all would exist. I believe it predicts that there will be non-resistant non-believers because the world is ambiguous in some ways, because God's operating at an epistemic distance. So there will be people who aren't hostile, but just find themselves in a state of disbelief because God's operating at an epistemic distance and not imposing his existence on that person. And as I stated before, I believe it also explains the reality of religious, because if you have different religions that are trying to explain the existence of a God who is operating at an epistemic distance, I
Yeah.
believe I believe it will cause, or I believe that you could reasonably predict that there'll be various interpretations of what the divine is because God is operating at an epistemic distance. And so I believe that if my theodicy is correct, I believe you can reasonably predict two things: that hiddenness would exist at all, and that things like religious diversity or religious ambiguity would exist. And like I said, I'm not trying to use this theodicy to explain why a certain person experiences an instance of divine hiddenness. Rather, I
Yeah.
want to say that we can expect divine hiddenness to be a reality if my theodicy works, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it does. I'm actually slightly distracted because like this pianist next door is like playing something
But
loud. No, I mean, I wonder if I have objections that I can challenge you with. I'm not entirely. I mean, oh no. I mean, I do think if something needs to be explained, it's not the oh man, I'm just really not, feeling God's existence today. Like, or like, honestly, a lot of days I'm just kind of not feeling it. Some days I do. Like, that, I don't really need to explain why God is hidden from them in those particular instances. What I want to be explained is Mother Teresa's journal, and I want other things like that explained. And like if the theodicy doesn't explain those, then like
sure,
I'm
let me
hungry
let
for
me. My
more.
my my goal wasn't necessarily to address specific instances of hiddenness, and we can get into specific instances of hiddenness,
Yeah,
which I would start drifting away from my theodicy and give another theodicy. My only goal was to say that some would argue that if hiddenness exists at all, or if hiddenness is true at all, or if we wouldn't reasonably predict hiddenness at all if God exists.
yeah, okay,
I'm
yeah,
that my theodicy predicts that God won't always be obvious,
yeah,
and
okay,
that's I just to say that hiddenness as a whole is not incompatible with God's existence. Now, if we want to get into the weeds of specific
Yeah.
instances of hiddenness, I'm open for that. But
Well, so correct me if I'm wrong. Again, I was like slightly distracted. So like, I think maybe I'm missing something. But like, so maybe it's something like the indeterminacy of human action and kind of the laws of nature and like the epistemic distance from that kind of inevitably, like maybe not necessarily, but like inevitably in a sense, kind of like allows for like people to just not have that kind of knowledge. Like there's just gonna be people that won't have that. Is that kind of maybe the point
yeah,
you're trying to make?
that's what
Yeah.
that's what I'm making.
Yeah, and so like I do think, and you probably, I know we've talked about this, and you probably have something to say about this. I think if God desires, all humans to be in, uh, if God is good, I don't know if a human not having the resources to accept Him, and being damned for that is going to be anything near morally justified. Um, so I think for those people that don't have the opportunity in this lifetime, I guess,
Sure,
to accept
we,
Christ or
we can we can
whatever.
shift from my theodicy. As I said before, my goal was only to explain or
Yeah,
to my theodicy predicts that hiddenness would exist, or that hiddenness isn't uh, unlikely.
yeah.
If my
So I guess the
so if
question now is,
we want to transition into specific instances of hiddenness, or even your question about if God really does want all people to know Him, especially if the eternal consequences are high. Why isn't He more obvious?
or like it just
Um,
give them like something, like maybe do they have an opportunity in the afterlife
sure,
or something? Um,
sure. Let's take. Let me start off by saying I am not committed to the idea that one has to have explicit knowledge of God in order to be in a relationship with God. For instance, imagine a mother and her 6-month old child. There are fewer relationships in the world that we think are quite as intimate and as personal as a mother and her 6-month old child. This
I already,
child,
yeah,
this child is not able to. I would say this child doesn't have propositional knowledge of her mother. She's not going to go. Premise one. If I came into the world, my existence has an explanation. Premise
yeah,
two. I've come into. No, this child has a relationship with his or her mother, even if it's not propositional knowledge. They have a deep and intimate relationship with their mother, even if they're not aware that their mother is their mother in the way that we talk as, fully grown adults. But likewise, imagine that mom works an office job, she works a 9 to 5, and she has coworkers who hate her guts. They gossip about her all the time. They leave her out of employee parties and other things like that. These coworkers surely have more propositional knowledge about this mother than the infant does, and yet we would say that these coworkers are not rightly related to that mother in a loving way.
yeah.
But the infant is related to that mother in a loving way, even though they don't have propositional
Okay,
knowledge.
yeah,
And I believe that people who, even though they may not know God, or they may say, I don't believe God exists, but if they are pursuing what the classical philosophers or the medieval philosophers called the transcendentals of truth, beauty, and goodness,
yeah.
and themselves rightly connected to truth, beauty, and goodness, I believe that they are connected to God in a way that is similar to the infant being connected to their mother. Though the infant may not be able to express the relationship with their mother, they do in fact have a relationship with their mother. And though an atheist or agnostic may not express their relationship with truth, beauty, and goodness as in propositional ways,
Mm-hmm.
just a child, I still believe that they have a relationship that's there. And one could ask, well, why would God allow for a person to have that kind of relationship that's not a the same intimate knowledge of someone that has propositional knowledge. And my pushback would be those coworkers have propositional knowledge of the mother, and yet they
Yeah.
don't have a relationship with the mother. Likewise, that child may not have propositional knowledge of the mother, but they still have an intimate knowledge of the mother. And likewise, I believe that there are several agnostics and atheists who do have intimate knowledge of God, even if it's not stated in a propositional way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that analogy with the mother and the child is it's very interesting. You know, I was trying to think of some kind of rebuttal. And so like this actually kind of this might get into so I really kind of like this question of religious ambiguity. Like I've spent it so in my preparation for the debate, I spent a good bit trying to figure out a theodicy for it, and I couldn't. So, so like I appealed to like interesting back roads to it, but no, I don't know why I brought that up. You got me thinking.
About how I would answer the problem of religious ambiguity.
No, 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 it wasn't that. It was I was just gonna say something that was just interesting to me. Uh, oh yeah, so there was maybe a question about like, are there people that don't even have like moral knowledge? Like maybe there's people that just lack the capability to be good, right? So like in a sense, like maybe they're not even like morally culpable for being morally wrong, if that's even coherent, right? It's like maybe someone doesn't have
Yeah,
this
and
intuition that murder is wrong, right? And they're just kind of like haphazardly killing people. This doesn't happen, but like you can imagine something like this happening, and it's like, well, this unfortunate situation.
and in your case, I would say that you could just, because I haven't really thought about an instance like that. Um, One could, I suppose, just appeal to a local application of skepticism and say, well, actually, more than that, they can say that if God is a morally perfect being, whatever God's judgments are of that person will be merciful and they'll be just.
Yeah,
And where skeptical theism goes in is we can say we don't know, we may not know how God will treat such a person, but we do know that whatever the treatment will be perfectly consistent with the fact that God is, as Anselm said, the greatest conceivable being. So whatever
yeah,
God's treatment of that person will be perfectly merciful and perfectly just.
yeah,
And
and I'm thinking right. So like maybe the proposition that all humans or nearly most humans have reliable access to what is moral, like working cognitive faculties with respect to morality, like that is a less tenuous claim than all people have knowledge that a God exists. So I think at the very least, this is going to be. I think you could appeal to, yeah, we pretty much all know what's right, and I think that could. It might be a little stronger defense than what you gave the skeptical theistic one, but I think even the stronger one kind of works here, and that's
yeah,
and it's better.
the
Other
only
one here.
reason that I appeal to skeptical theism is you were saying this person just has moral cognitive faculties that just aren't working.
Yeah,
And and I'm, to be perfectly honest, I'm an agnostic in my understanding of what justice requires or the nature of justice. I'm not exactly sure what it means for perfect justice to be or for perfect justice to take place. But where the skeptical theism comes in is I can say that I know that God, as a actually morally perfect being, would know what that kind of just act would
yeah.
look
Yeah,
like.
I do like this mixture of like theodicy, but then you have some sprinkling of skeptical theism, and like the
Yeah,
thing kind of works.
I think you
Like I
can.
like it.
I don't know if I'm the first person to coin the phrase local skeptical theism. I don't know if anyone else said it, but I like calling
Yeah,
certain applications of skeptical theism to certain types of evil. I like calling it local skeptical theism,
yeah,
and
I like that. Yeah,
I think local pockets of skeptical theism can work without having detrimental effects.
yeah. So what one thing I was gonna bring up earlier, maybe hopefully it won't get too off track, but maybe you can present a problem of evil from the inability to choose what you believe, right? So there's this kind of thought where it's like, you know, maybe we can have free will, right? But that doesn't mean like we have freedom over what we believe. And so I actually have this video on my YouTube channel, very short clip. Everyone should go check it out. Like and subscribe is great. But basically, the thought experiment is you walk past the lake, and you just kind of end up believing that a lake was there. It's not like you sat down. You're like, you know what? Okay, so it seems like there's a lake in front of me. I'm gonna like work really hard to like believe it. I'm gonna like no. You just the belief maybe pops into existence uncaused out of nothing. No, but like it just kind of like it's in your mind. And maybe someone might push back and they might say something like, well, like clearly like if you wanted to if you wanted to like really convince yourself of a belief that you actually were becoming skeptical of because you're scared of losing your intellectual integrity, like you can kind of choose to believe that strongly. But I think what it would take in order to convince yourself of something is to simply expose yourself to ideas that happen to convince you. That's where the choice can come in, right? You can choose to maybe, let's say, if you were becoming skeptical of your pro-life position and you got really scared that you were going to be really wrong about this because you confronted the work of Judith Jarvis Thompson and a bunch of and other maybe philosophical thinkers, and you got really scared. You're like, maybe this pro-choice thing is right. That I want pro-life to be true, and so I'm going to go listen to Charlie Kirk and all of this stuff, and I'm going to like expose myself to this pro-life stuff, and like, finally, I'm relieved. It's not like you chose to to be convinced of pro-life again. You chose to expose yourself to things that ended up convincing you, right? So there's kind of a problem where it's like we don't have the ability to choose what we believe at all, right? It's not a kind of power that humans have, right? So like why would God kind of allow this world where like we just have these beliefs that God doesn't exist and that other things. So yeah.
Well, I'm going to take my generic theist hat off and put on my Christian theist hat.
Yeah.
I believe in something called. Let me take a few steps back. So I do believe that God does love every person. He loves all individuals. And I think that perfect being theism entails that God loves all individuals. Now, not all Christian theists will agree with me on that. But in the tradition that I find myself in, which is called Arminianism, there's a belief that God gives something called prevenient grace to all people. And what prevenient grace does is it convicts sinners. It convicts people of their sin, of righteousness, of judgment. So what that means is the person, we all have experiences with guilt. We all have experiences where we sense that we are morally accountable, if not to God, at least to ourselves and to our own conscience. And what prevenient grace, all it seeks to say is that God speaks to all people through their consciences. Now, whether or not a person interprets that as, well, this is God speaking through my conscience, or this is just my conscience, all prevenient grace says is that call of the voice of God through conscience goes out to all people. And though a person may not have a choice on whether or not they believe God exists, I do believe they have a choice in how they're going to respond to that call that goes out to their conscience. That call
Yeah.
that goes out to conscience that says, I should live a life of virtue rather than a life of vice. I should choose to pursue beauty instead of ugliness. I should choose to pursue goodness instead of evil. I should choose to pursue truth instead of lies. And perhaps that person goes, I don't think I can do this on my own. And they kind of surrender to the fact that they can't do that on their own. Even if they don't believe Jesus exists, they surrender to that fact, but they still want to, we'll throw the word grace, by grace, even though they don't believe Jesus exists, they still want to pursue a life of virtue rather than a life of vice. And all I'm committed to saying is people are held accountable, not in necessarily whether they believe God exists or doesn't exist as a result of this grace, but how they respond to that grace when it comes. Will I listen to the call of virtue, or will I reject the call of virtue and pursue vice? Now, I believe that all those who respond by choosing virtue are in reality choosing God, even if they don't realize that is in fact what they are doing. And so you're right. I don't believe we have necessarily direct control over our beliefs. But I don't think the grace that I described requires one to have direct control over their beliefs, but rather the control we do have is on whether or not we're going to pursue virtue or vice. And I believe those who truly are seeking after virtue are, in fact, seeking after Christ, who is himself the source of virtue. And what I'm arguing for is a Christian position known as inclusivism. And it was beautifully illustrated in the end of C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, where there's this character named Tash, who, for those who haven't read The Last Battle, there's this false messiah called Tash. He claims to be the lion Aslan, who's a Christ type, and the false god Tash, is evil, does all these horrible things, and he had there was a I can't remember the character's name. I should remember his name. There was this character, like an elf or something, who followed after. Oh, what's the name? There was like a Hebrew word for truth. Ameth. There's this character named Ameth, which I think is the Hebrew word for truth, who was following after Tash, and he was following after Tash sincerely. But then the book ends, and he discovers that Tash was a false messiah. He wasn't actually Aslan. And Tash stands before Aslan, and he's terrified. He's like, I've been following this, false messiah. And Aslan says something to the effect of, all of your sincere prayers that were offered to Tash were heard by me. And he makes a statement, and Lewis said in other places in his writing, he's like, all prayers to the false gods are heard by the one true God. And Lewis isn't saying that, all religions are equal or all religions don't matter. He's saying that God is in fact so merciful and so gracious that he sees the disposition of your heart and responds to the disposition of your heart, not necessarily to the epistemic content of your beliefs, but rather the condition is of your heart. And so I think if what I just said is true, then I believe that is a way to work around the concern of, we can't choose our beliefs. That means we're all screwed.
Yeah.
I think it works. Yeah. I think it is able to, in my estimation, sufficiently answer that. And other philosophers and theologians have argued that perhaps one of the reasons why God is hidden is perhaps certain people would, if they were convinced that God exists or that a religion were true, they wouldn't be virtuous people. They would accept the religion and live a life of vice. As we know, there are plenty of religious people who live horrible lives. And some have argued that perhaps God is hidden from some skeptics because he knows that
that's interesting. I've heard that book.
To live virtuously. They'll seek to live virtuously in a way that they wouldn't if they were convinced that God exists. So there are all that to say that there are a lot of potential reasons for why God allows certain pockets or certain instances of hiddenness to exist. And I don't believe any of them are sufficient to cast serious doubt on the proposition that God exists, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, okay. I mean, that's so fascinating. Wow. Like, I think your theodicy is like really interesting, and honestly, it's one of the more powerful ones. It like subverts all of the objections and like accounts for data you wouldn't expect, and it's like this cool. No, okay. So, if you had any final words for the people listening, or what would you say?
About the problem of evil and hiddenness, like the whole 9 yards.
I guess maybe we could summarize a little bit as well.
Well, summarize the first half of this interview conversation. I said that if we believe that only God is perfect, now I remember I had 4 propositions. I think they were: only God is perfect. God designed the laws of nature. The laws of nature won't be perfect, and God is going to operate at an epistemic distance to ensure the integrity of human freedom. If you believe that those 4 propositions are true, you can reasonably predict and expect there to be gratuitous natural and gratuitous moral evil. And I argued that if my theodicy is correct, then gratuitous natural evil and gratuitous moral evil are consistent with the existence of God. And I also argued that when tragedy strikes, you don't have to say, why did God allow this specific evil? But rather you can say, evil happens. But God is
Yeah.
at work in the midst of all evil, redeeming it for our good, for his glory, even if he's not the direct cause of that particular evil event. And then I also argued that this theodicy can reasonably predict the existence of divine hiddenness, because if God is operating at an epistemic distance, it's reasonable to conclude that some people will not see God's existence as obvious. And then we went into the finer points of divine hiddenness, and I argued for what's commonly known as an inclusivist approach to the problem of divine hiddenness, that being that one can have knowledge of God even if it's not explicit knowledge of God. And the
Yeah.
examples I used were the example of a child and its relationship with its mother, and also the character Emeth from C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle. And so if I'm going to conclude, I'll say that evil exists, God is sometimes hidden, but God exists.
Yeah, God exists. By the way, Christianity is true. Cameron Bertuzzi. Yeah.
No,
Okay.
we don't have
Well,
copyright on it. We'll get sued.
well, thank you so much, John. It has been fantastic. Yeah, so next week we're going to do a debate. Hopefully, Stephen comes on and moderates. We're going to do a debate on theism versus atheism, and we're taking each other's positions. So that's going to be fantastic. Yeah, so thank you so much for watching.
All right.